You've heard of high net worth, but we're talking about high net purpose. We want to find out how entrepreneurs and global leaders in our network are allocating financial, human, and intellectual capital in the pursuit of purpose. But more importantly, we want to understand the compromises, the paradoxes in their approaches, pitch decks, and philosophies. Welcome back to our latest episode. I'm your host, Joe McCarthy. With the backdrop of the escalating conflicts around the world and further climate disasters impacting some of the most vulnerable on our planet, we are joined at Island Bridge's offices in London by none other than David Miliband. Nicknamed during his time in Tony Blair's government as the Brains, he was one of Britain's youngest ever foreign secretaries. Today, he sits as the CEO of the International Rescue Committee in New York, where in his role, he allocates $1.6 billion per annum in over 40 different countries. The mission is helping people whose lives and livelihoods are shattered by conflict and disaster. He shares insights on how his upbringing as a child of two refugees has shaped his life purpose. He also spells out how he believes philanthropy can play a major role in bridging the gap where governments have retreated from some of their historic roles as global guardians. In this podcast, he also shares his philosophy of taking action, taking risk, and speaking out on the principles of what you believe in. This is the David Miliband episode. David Miliband, welcome to High Net Purpose.
Thank you, Joe. Good to be with you.
So this conversation is not going to be a biography.
Good.
It's
of you or of me?
Of you. It's simply too much to cover in one conversation. And I have a feeling that the story is not really yet finished or written. So we will start with talking about your purpose. But then what we want to get into is a conversation about the truths of the global refugee crisis at the moment, and then try and understand the solution business that you're in, not the suffering business. So with that, do you have an articulation of your purpose?
Well, I always say to people that two things come above all others. There are two things that I'll take a phone call for, or there are two things that keep me going. One is a strong sense that I was brought up with, that if you can make a difference to make the world more just, you should. And if you don't, it's a waste. And then the second is that I have a responsibility to my family that is a trump card, really, that has to come before everything else. And so I think those are the two things that I want to be best at.
You've spoken publicly before about your parents, that they were displaced refugees, but at the same time, you sort of fall short of wanting to overstate that impact on you. Why?
Because I was brought up by a generation. My dad was a refugee from Belgium in 1940. He was 16 years old. And my mum spent the war, she's both Jewish. My mum spent the war in hiding in Poland. And they did what a lot of immigrant families do, I think, refugee families. And I'm not saying this is the right thing, and I'm not saying that others who do it differently are doing anything wrong, but they wanted me and my brother to have the security that they didn't have. So they didn't spend their time drumming into us, think how I was born in 1965, think how lucky you are, it's a miracle that you're here, etc. They didn't say that. They honored the history that they'd been through, but they didn't live in it. And they didn't want us to feel the same sense of mortal threat that they had felt. And so they tried to strike a balance between gratitude, if you like, and optimism, and a sense that we had a fresh start. And so I don't want to overplay the story. People sometimes say to me, well, you don't look like a refugee. I say, well, I'm not a refugee. I was born up in a relatively secure, but my parents were refugees. And they say, oh, I see, I get it. So I guess that reflects some of the, you could say, diffidence about how heavily to play the story. The other thing is, I'm a Brit. We're not great at talking about ourselves. And maybe I've learned a bit living in New York for the last 10 years that actually your personal story matters more than I'd given it credit for.
But there must have been something going on at home that it produced two sons who were both MPs and members of the cabinet simultaneously.
Well, I think that this sense that if you can make a difference, you should, and if you don't, it's a waste, was quite strong. I think that we were encouraged to have our own opinions. which was a great thing in many ways. And I suppose we were also brought up with a sense that you can make a difference. People make a difference. And I guess that's the best explanation.
How's it been, an Englishman living in New York?
Well, Sting wrote that song about Quentin Crisp, and he, I don't understand the line about having your toast toasted only on one side, but I do. The line "Be yourself, no matter what they say," is quite a nice line, and something. The reason Sting has become a good friend, and he came to do our gala dinner last November, and he actually sang Englishman in New York, but he also he played it on a guitar that he'd been given in a prison in southern Italy, and the guitar had been made by prisoners from the wreckage of boats that had been used by refugees trying to arrive in Italy.
Wow.
From the Middle East and North Africa. And he said in this, in his little, he talked as well as sang, and he said that the prison represented, was people who had no freedom, and the guitar was people searching for freedom. And he explained in an incredibly moving way that, of course, no one knows whether the people who were in the boat that now has been made into a guitar, whether they survived or not. So that's a long-winded way of saying, how does it feel to be an Englishman in New York?
Yeah.
I mean, it is. You're still an Englishman, so you're still a foreigner. But New York's got, it's got something about it.
Why did you take the role at the?
Well, I'll tell you what I told them at the job interview, which is the most honest thing. I said, look, I like lists, so I said there are 3 reasons I'm going for the job. One is that I think I like solving big problems and how you get medical aid into Syria, rebel-controlled Syria, how you do education in Afghanistan, how you tackle sexual violence in Democratic Republic of Congo. Those are big, difficult questions, and how you do it for millions of people, not just hundreds of people, is really a tough challenge. I like difficult problems. Second, I said that the International Rescue Committee, which is the organization I lead, it was founded by Albert Einstein, for goodness sake. I mean, you can't get better shoulders to stand on. He was a refugee in New York. He was despairing of the lack of empathy from Americans right up to President Roosevelt for people trapped in Europe, Jews, but also other oppressed minorities. And he set up the IRC to help save them. Our first employee worked in Marseille in the late 1930s, early 1940s. He issued 2,000 fake passports to people like Marc Chagall to get them out of Nazi-occupied Europe. But this organization that had this history, no one had heard of it.
So you thought it was a sleeping giant?
Bit of a sleeping giant.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, I actually said my parents were refugees, and there's a closing of the circle in helping people in the modern era in a way that my parents were helped by people who did the right thing.
Can you give us a sense for the scale of?
Yeah, we were a $450 million organization 10 years ago. We're now a $1.6 billion organization. That's our annual income and expenditure. And most important, we're helping more people. So we helped about 33 million people last year. About a quarter of them are people caught up in war zones. So Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan today. A quarter of them are internally displaced. So they're homeless in their own country. That means people in Syria, people in Ethiopia. A third of them are refugees and asylum seekers, so people from Myanmar who were driven across the border into Bangladesh, people crossing the southern border in the US. And then the fourth group are what are called host populations. So Jordanians, Lebanese, who've suddenly found, oh my God, there's 100,000 Syrians have arrived in our town. And so that's the makeup. And the thing that in some ways I'm most proud of, we are 3% of the humanitarian sector, and we've grown. And people think, oh, it's good that you've grown. Yeah, but more significant, although we're only 3% of the humanitarian sector, 30% of all of the evaluations of impact, of evidence, of innovation are done by us.
Explain that.
So we do more testing, randomized control trials, impact assessments of whether these interventions actually work, or what kind of malnutrition intervention work, what kind of educational impact happens when you use different kinds of educational software. Its impact is what we're meant to be about, but there's historically been this view, well, if it's a matter of life and death, you can't afford to do an impact evaluation. We have the opposite view. If it's a matter of life and death, it's doubly important that you do an impact evaluation in an emergency. And so we are an organization that tries to be the thought leaders of the humanitarian sector. But as you indicated in your introduction, we're about solutions. And the charity sector, I think, doesn't do it itself any good if it just advertises suffering. You can get a click for that. But actually what change makers are interested in is solutions.
And you changed the mission from refugees and others to people in poverty because of conflict and disaster. Is that accurate?
Almost, but the precision matters. When I arrived, we were defined as an organization that helped refugees and others with life-changing and life-saving interventions. And I thought, well, who wants to be an other?
Yeah.
No thanks. Secondly, life-saving, I know how to measure that, but life-changing, how do you measure that? So we said, well, who do we serve? And we said, we serve people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. And it's unusual to have a mission statement that's got a word as evocative as shattered, lives that are shattered. So that was important to us, but crisis and disaster. And that narrows us. We work in about 40 countries, and we're not trying to work in 140 countries, because the danger for NGOs is they just boil the ocean and they sort of spread themselves too thin. And then we said, well, how are we going to measure success? And we said, well, we want to help those people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster survive, recover, and gain control of their futures. And so we can say today that every single person working on an IRC program is working towards an identified outcome which has a measurable output.
Got it. But so how do you frame humanitarian aid and development aid?
Well, I think that is a question that has tortured PhD students for a very long time. And the truth is that there are some very bad definitions. People say, well, humanitarian means emergency, development means long-term. People say, well, humanitarian is about the heart, development's about the head. These aren't good distinctions. There's another distinction which has more integrity to it, but which I don't buy, which says humanitarian is only about life-saving. So it's only about life-saving healthcare. Basically, that's it. And that everything else is development. What I say now is humanitarian aid is the first step on the road to development. Helping people survive and then helping them to thrive are part of a continuum.
So you're a hybrid, somewhere in between. You seem to be...
I like to think that we're distinctive, and we're defined by the crises that affect our populations that we serve. We call them clients, and we're also defined and distinctive because of the solutions that we're advocating that frankly cross this humanitarian development bog of words that get in the way. We're about people who are in conditions of trauma and tragedy for no fault of their own and who need help, not forgetting, if there's a surgeon that we've got in Gaza today, he or she is doing life-saving operation. But the biggest authors of life-saving are the people themselves. So we're helping people survive, recover, and gain control of their futures.
1.6 billion, where does it come from?
We've gone from 10% private funding to 35% private funding, from the 10% at 400 million privately funded to 35% of 1.6 billion. So the 2/3 of our money that comes from governments is significant US support, EU, European Union, other European governments. The UK's been historically a strong funder, a bit fluctuating over the last years as the aid budget's been cut. Not much money from the Gulf, so the so-called new donors, but some. And then our private donors are about a third mass markets, so less than $100 a pop, less than $5,000 a year. A third is corporates and foundations, which are generally restricted grants. So we won the MacArthur Award. Mike Bloomberg is our largest private donor. He gives us $10 million a year to invest in our data systems, because he knows the hardest thing to fundraise for is the unrestricted funds that end up paying for your infrastructure. And of course, some of the charity monitoring bodies mark you down if you spend money on IT, which is stupid in my view. They call that bureaucracy, not program funding. Whereas actually, we were able to come through COVID because we'd invested in our IT. So there's of the private funding, a third is mass markets, a third is the corporates and foundations, and then a third is high net worth. And that's growing, and that's very important. We need much more of it.
And you need it unrestricted to have the most impact.
Well, the unrestricted is the greatest flexibility. It allows us to pace over the long term. I always say to people, a multi-year commitment is incredibly valuable because it allows us to plan in a sector that is defined by lack of planning.
How do you remain independent with funding coming from governments?
I'm so proud. I mean, we give the US government a hell of a beating on all sorts of things, even though they give us a lot of money. And that, I think, is a mark of the humanitarian principles. I mean, we were working in Yemen, and we had strong critique of the US role in the Yemen civil war, and we said so. And I think that our humanitarian principles are about independence, neutrality, impartiality, and humanity. Those sound like apple pie, but they're tough. I mean, impartiality and neutrality in conflict is a hard, a narrow road to follow, but it means you're on the side of the civilians, you're not on the side of each party.
So for, I guess, most current is Gaza, where you've been calling for the ceasefire, and you've been doing that from the basis of this is a humanitarian crisis and need, because it's a lightning rod issue in the US. And it's amazing how you're able to manage all of that sort of donor.
Well, it's a lightning rod issue everywhere.
Yeah.
What happened on October 7th was appalling and inexcusable and totally contrary to international humanitarian law, did nothing for Palestinians. But what's happening in Gaza since October the 7th is also an extraordinary assault on humanity as well. And there are 130 hostages still being held, and there are 34,000 Gazans who've been killed, 35,000. And there are 2 million people, 2.1 million people, who are innocent Palestinian civilians who are suffering to extraordinary length and face dire prospects that get worse every day the fighting continues. And I spoke to our emergency team leader earlier this week. We had a rotation of one of our emergency teams out of a hospital in Gaza on Monday, which was the day that the Rafah offensive started. And it takes a lot to shock some of our experienced humanitarian aid workers, but it's a shocking situation.
You've talked about the geography of poverty has changed. So the extreme poverty is actually starting to reduce in stable countries, but it's reversed in the other countries.
Yeah, this is really important for people. That, I mean, in my lifetime, you've gone from a situation where vast numbers of the world's extreme poor lived in a country like China or India, but if you have 5% growth rates, never mind 9% growth rates, which the Chinese have had for 30 years, you're going to bring a lot of people out of poverty. And so the story of stable states, not commenting on whether they're democratic or not, is a positive story. It doesn't say trickle-down economics works, but there's been a definite leveling up. And so now more than half of the world's extreme poor live in states that are affected by conflict. And if you're born in a state that's conflict-ridden, your life chances, I remember once to see, you're 20 times more likely to end up in poverty than if you're in a stable state. And in a way, something like Bangladesh and Myanmar show the difference. If you're in Bangladesh, things are going up, even though there's still a lot of poverty. If you're in Myanmar and you're part of the Rohingya minority, you're subject to ethnic cleansing. If you're in Sudan today, I was in South Sudan, which is a neighboring country, was formerly part of Sudan, in February. And you've got 19 million people thrown into humanitarian need by a civil war. And you've got people trekking, I can't get this out of my head, a woman, she's a hairdresser in Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan. Her husband's a shoemaker. She had 2 kids going to university. All 4 of them have been driven 700 kilometers south. And they're saying, well, are we ever going to get out of here? It wasn't even a refugee camp. It was a kind of refugee informal settlement.
At the international level, you talked too about the fact that we've moved out of a world where there was more collaboration into I think we call multi-aligned rather than multipolar. What do you mean by
So
that?
this idea of a multi-aligned world is that you've got, multipolar suggests a balance of power. Multi-aligned is more fluid, more transactional, more dangerous, more what I call flammable. I would say that the world today is a flammable world. There's a lot of tinder out there, and it's catching fire. And that multi-aligned world has greatest toll for people who are caught up in conflict. The 20 countries in our emergency watch list represent 86% of total humanitarian need in the world. And essentially what's happened is two big things, I think. One, the situation in these countries, resource-stressed, conflict-ridden, has captured more people, but the guardrails that protect people have also weakened because of international political division. And you can see that in the UN Security Council, you can see that in China-US standoff, you can see that in geopolitics overall.
And these people are at the front end of this big change.
Well, they're at the sharp end, and they're bearing the greatest brunt of it. I mean, and it piles agony upon agony because the climate vulnerable countries, it's something you're passionate about, mitigating climate change. And I was Secretary of State for the Environment 15 years ago, and at that time, we published the world's first long-term emissions reduction, legally binding emissions reduction plan. We published a Stern report about why fighting climate change was cheaper than living with climate change. But at the time, adaptation was a poor cousin of mitigation. Now, we've got to do both. Because we haven't done enough mitigation, we've got to do more adaptation. But the people that we're serving, they are in the most climate vulnerable countries in the main, and they have the least investment in climate adaptation. So there's a double or triple whammy that they're facing.
Because that Notre Dame,
that's why I mean sharp end.
Yeah, that Notre Dame index, which is highlighting those countries that are most vulnerable, accounts for most of the countries on your risk.
14 of the 20 countries on our watch list are in the top quartile of the Notre Dame index.
So when we spoke in New York a couple of months ago, you mentioned how you describe the climate crisis with the refugee crisis, and that you're sometimes wary of putting them both together.
Yeah, I don't. Can you give me more of a clue as to what I said?
So in terms of saying to people, if we deal with the climate crisis, it will then help the refugee.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, well, there are two things I say. One is, people often ask me, well, are there loads of climate refugees? And I say, look, the definition of refugee is someone for whom it's not safe to go home, and so they leave their own country. If we're going to be accurate about this, the number of people who've left their own country purely because of climate is relatively limited. The number of people who've shifted within their own country, in other words, their climate IDPs, climate internally displaced, is much higher. So Bangladesh would be an example of that. So the first thing that I'm careful about throwing the language of climate refugees. The second thing is, we should deal with climate change and the climate crisis because it's a crisis for humanity, and not rely on saying, if we don't deal with the climate crisis, it'll be terrible, there'll be loads of refugees. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't want to use the refugee quote unquote threat. I don't think it's an effective lever for galvanizing climate action.
So the scenario work that we mentioned that we did with the families a couple of weeks ago, when you looked into 2040 and you said, listen, if we get to 2 degrees above, and we get the population growth in Africa and the Middle East that's expected based on current fertility rates, you'll have these populations which will unlikely be able to pay for the electricity to desalinate the water, and their crops won't be surviving. So off the back of that, we will see further migration of populations and creation of more refugees. But how can you? I find it hard not to de-link the two things.
Well, we should tell the truth about it. I would say two things about that. First of all, a lot depends on domestic action within Africa with international support about mitigation and development. And the question of whether or not they can leapfrog to lower or low carbon trajectories of development is a choice, not a fate.
Yeah.
Second thing is, for people who do move as a result of the climate crisis, they'll move within Africa. So we've just got to be accurate about this. The danger that the rich world, the rich North gets itself into, and rich Europe gets itself into a place where, oh my God, all these people are coming. Well, actually, most people are going to be transitioning within Africa. And then the third thing is, I'm afraid the experience is that people will put up walls to stop them coming. And so I'm just leery. I'm a bit reticent of trying to. I don't like refugees being described as a threat because they're fleeing for their lives. And I don't think it's an effective cudgel with which to beat up people into taking more climate action.
On that point of where people get displaced to, you produce some great information. It's available on your website. But that was certainly something I hadn't realized, that you've got this sort of myth breaking that more than 80% of these people who are displaced go to poor countries and moving from Sudan down to South Sudan.
Yes.
They're stuck versus the media that they're all coming across the border.
Yes, I mean, it's actually now down to 76% because the Ukraine crisis is unusual because most Ukrainians who are refugees have gone into Europe, which is obviously richer than the norm. But the biggest refugee hosting states, Uganda with South Sudanese refugees would be an example, Bangladesh with Myanmar refugees, Pakistan with Afghan refugees. Most of them are low. Turkey with Syrian refugees is a lower middle income country. But most refugees, that 76% figure, are in poor or lower middle income countries. Now, that's not to say that Europe and America are not desirable places that people are trying to get to. And we'll never have an orderly or effective refugee or migration system if we pretend it's not a challenge. But I always say to people, this choice is not, are there refugees and asylum seekers coming to Europe or America or not? The choice is, do they come in a legal, orderly, organized, safe way, or in a disorganized, illegal, unsafe way? That's the argument.
The far right is weaponizing the refugee crisis. How do you build that into?
I think you defray that by managing it. That you're absolutely right. There are some people trying to exploit the refugee crisis. The answer to that is to manage it. It's not to deny it. It's to manage it, and to manage it in a way that's fair, and in a way that's orderly. And I think that is doable. Actually, Germany is a good example of efficient, effective processing, 1.5 million asylum seekers in 2015-16. It didn't cost Mrs. Merkel her re-election. It's not the main driver of the far right in Germany at the moment. Actually, the far right in Germany, the thing to worry about is they've moved on to climate. And they've moved on to climate action as the mobilizing, and the cost of climate action as the mobilizing issue, sometimes tied in with migration. I don't want to underestimate in next door to Germany and France, migration is the issue that is being weaponized, but it's not actually refugees, it's actually migration that's being weaponized.
So how have you developed your thinking around the disruption that's caused by refugees when they come into a country? And you talked about creating a fair and orderly method, but it's a fact that it will cause disruption.
Well, disruption is a very loaded way of putting it. I think when my granddad and dad came to London in 1940, their lives had been much more disrupted than the disruption they caused when they came here. My granddad went to help take furniture out of bombed out buildings, to rescue furniture from bombed out buildings. My dad went to Acton Technical College. So disruption, I know what you're saying, and I'll come on to what I think can be disrupted.
Because it's clear that the US has been shaped by migration. I'm an immigrant into the UK.
Yeah.
I'm Irish, and it used to be a policy of no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. So I'm aware of the positive, but how do we?
Yeah, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, but I just think disruption is it's only disruptive if it's not organized to be managed and organized. And the management is fast processing. The management is integration of a serious kind. The management is sharing out around the country. For family reasons, I went to a very small town in southwestern Germany 4 years ago. It was actually the site of the concentration camp where my grandfather was killed. And there they were resettling, I think, 55 refugees as part of the dispersal and integration program. So I think that if there is very fast rise in numbers and they're very concentrated in where they are, then that can be disruptive. But I don't think we should say there's an inevitability about that.
Very helpful. The on the ground, 2/3 of your clients are women and girls.
Yeah.
Can you give us more background to why that is? And you've been highly successful in combining a lot of what you do on social service and economic service, etc. Could you give us some color for that?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukraine example is the most obvious example, where if you're a man between the ages of 18 and 60, you're conscripted into the army. So inevitably, the vast bulk of Ukrainian refugees are women and kids. But it's also the case in Sudan. It's also the case in Syria that the majority are women and girls. And there are two main reasons for that. One, the men stay behind to try and protect what they had. And the men are in fighting groups. So they're recruited into militias or into national armies, the fighting. So there's challenge there. But we know that women and girls face extra abuse, inequality, poverty when they are caught up in crisis. And sexual violence is a terrible part of the emergency humanitarian experience, the opposite of humanitarian, the emergency crisis experience. We found, it's interesting, in the 1990s, the IRC, well before my time, did a lot of work about helping women recover from sexual violence, which was very effective proven to be effective in Democratic Republic of Congo. We then did separate work in the 2000s about economic empowerment of women. But then when you combine them, you get more than double the benefit. So the survivors of sexual violence, if they have a social service program, but if you give them an economic opportunity, it makes even more difference. And so we try to make sure, I mean, we're an organization that does healthcare. We're not spread too thin, but we do more than one thing. We do healthcare, we do water and sanitation, we do education work, we do employment work, and we do protection for women and kids. And the greatest impact is when you can roll those things together. You asked about unrestricted funding earlier. That helps you to do that. Often the money we get is very siloed, so you're just doing water and sanitation or you're just doing education. And actually the most productive work is where you can give a social and an economic element to it.
Given the size of the organization now and your background, it does allow you to exercise some political pressure that other organizations would never be able to get to.
I wouldn't call it political.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
What would you call it?
Sort of humanitarian.
Yeah. But you guys can influence government.
I wish we were more influential.
Yeah. But you can talk to the World Bank. You can talk to a range of organizations globally that would be unobtainable by a lot of other organizations to bring around that change because of the funding that you get.
Well, I think that our biggest calling card is actually the quality of the work that we do. If we weren't good at what we do, and I always say to people, because I've sat on the other side of the desk in government, you don't need another NGO to come and tell you what's wrong. You need an NGO to come and tell you what you can do to put it right. And you know, we're always trying to bring expert witness to bear, because that's actually our best calling card. Expert witness of what's actually going on, whether in Ukraine or in Sudan or in Gaza at the moment. Expert witness to what actually works. So like the examples we've just been giving. We stick to our lane, but we're willing to call out impunity when we see it. We're willing to call out inefficiency when we see it. We're willing to call out inhumanity when we see it.
Can you touch on the Atlas of impunity and...
Yeah, this is something I do in a private capacity. I co-chair the advisory board of something called the Atlas of Impunity. This is the germ of this. The origin of this comes from the fact that we had two IRC humanitarian aid workers driving an ambulance across northwest Syria in 2016, and they were targeted by a Russian missile and were killed. And it brought starkly home what the absence of the rule of law means in conflict zones around the world. And I then gave a lecture about the age of impunity, because the more you look at it, the more you see civilians are now the majority victims of conflict, not soldiers, and the aid workers are less safe. 200 aid workers have been killed in Gaza in the last 7 months. And that's impunity, because impunity is the exercise of power without accountability, of crimes without punishment. And the Atlas of Impunity ranks every country in the world on 5 dimensions of impunity: conflict, governance, human rights, but also economic exploitation, both of workers and of states seizing the property rights of property owners. And fifthly, interesting, I think, given your interests, the climate crisis is an example of impunity. Well, why is that impunity? Well, it's the exercise of power by one generation over future generations who don't have a vote. And it's the exercise of power of humans over the planet, because the planet doesn't have a vote. So anyway, that's published every year. People can look at atlasofimpunity.org. It's published independently by the Eurasia Group and the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs. I think it's an interesting lens. It's a better lens than democracy versus autocracy to understand what's going on in the world.
And the accountability that you're talking about isn't just on these troubled parts of the world. It's also looking at the West and potentially what may happen in the US later this year.
America scores. I mean, America is in the top half, but it's quite close to the median of the 190 countries. The European countries are higher up. And the US falls short on some violence indicators, on some environmental indicators. So it speaks truth.
I know you get asked this all the time, but you've got a very articulate answer to it. How do you remain hopeful?
I remain hopeful by commending to people this fantastic phrase that I learned from a film crew that went to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. If you look at the statistics, you get depressed. If you look at the people, you have hope. And I think that's very powerful. I tried to develop that further. I did a lecture in Cambridge last November, Cambridge, UK. And I said, look, what keeps the learnings, the 3 learnings I've had about how to stay hopeful and optimistic, other than just remembering the world has more resources to do more good than any time in human history. 1, a bias to action, and our organization has a bias to action. 2, an embrace of risk. In our innovation fund, we have a 40% failure rate. That's good, not bad. If we had no failure in our innovation fund, we wouldn't be trying enough things. And 3rd, to speak to universal values, because if we don't hold on to them, then we're all lost.
So before closing questions, with the fact that the government and politics is in retreat, the gap and the call to action for corporates, families and individuals is what?
I think that governments are in retreat from big global problems, and therefore NGOs and the corporate sector and philanthropists have to step up together. Look, there'd never been an early childhood development intervention in a humanitarian setting of $100 million. But we won the MacArthur Prize to do it. And it wouldn't have happened. No government would take the risk of that kind of philanthropy. The work that we do with philanthropists to really push the boundaries on how's AI going to be used to inform displaced people about where to find safety. Many more of them have a phone. How are we going to use that? How are we going to push forward the boundaries of education and technology so to help kids learn when they have interrupted educations? We've got a lot more that we're going to do by changing the way the humanitarian sector works. But governments are risk averse, so we need corporates and philanthropists to come in, and they've got to come in. I mean, there are too many bespoke programs. I need people who are going to come in and say, look, I've seen what you're doing on X, but I want to help you do 10X. So scaling is the big need of what we know works. And for that, we need philanthropy, we need corporates, we need voice on that affects governments. Because I always say to people, big change happens when you get mass mobilization, corporate and NGO innovation, and government leadership. But they come in different orders.
Yeah.
And at the moment, government leadership is not going to deliver it. So we're going to have to find the solutions amongst the rest of us.
You sort of answered this, but for you, what does philanthropy well done look like?
Anything well done depends on listening. Philanthropy that tells you how much it knows is not going to be as good as philanthropy that says, how much do you know? When I went into the Foreign Office in 2007 as Foreign Sec, I said, yes, we'll lead, but we're first of all going to listen. And so good philanthropy listens. Good philanthropy, I'm careful. I don't want philanthropy to be too patient. I think philanthropy needs to be urgent. That doesn't mean it should be hasty, but it needs a sense of urgency, and it needs to push for fast test, fast fail. Let's go for this. So urgent philanthropy. I think that where the patience does come in, it's multi-year. If any charity tells any of your philanthropists they're going to solve world poverty in a year, then they shouldn't give them any money, because it's not going to happen. You can't solve world poverty in a year, but you can make a dent on global poverty fast. That's the point. And I think that, like anything really, good philanthropy learns. I mean, for example, the MacArthur $100 million award that I talked about, I mean, they were an outstanding partner, because neither did they say, here's $100 million, come back in 5 years' time, nor did they say, come back every week and we'll mark your homework. They helped co-create, they invested in co-creation, they invested in research and learning, and they course-corrected. My big learning is you've got to course-correct as you go along.
Because there's a fashion towards having established metrics and putting them on every organization, which looks completely different, solving for different things.
Well, good metrics are good, but bad metrics are bad. So, I mean, the metric that says what's the percentage of your income that goes on quote-unquote programs, to the extent you get penalized for spending more on IT, I mean, that's a bad metric. I think that outcome metrics are good. We want more intelligent accountability. So ask me, well, how much difference to kids' social and emotional and academic learning does your education program work? Ask what's the relapse rate in your malnutrition program? What's the cost efficiency of your malnutrition program? Outcome indicators are good. Ticking the boxes for inputs is not so good. So, don't knock metrics. I mean, we should, but the right kind of metrics.
So in closing, how do you manage to keep it all together? How do you find space for yourself?
I'm not very good at that. But I think that I find renewal in being passionate about things. And so if you're learning, if you're zestful, if you're committed, I mean, I've learned the hard way that you can't parent if you've got a mobile phone in your hand, so you've got to be better at that. You learn from your mistakes as well as your successes. You learn from the patience of my wife. I learn from the patience of my wife, and she keeps me improving. And you got to try and not be too scared of things. I'm playing football tonight. I told you I'm going. It so happens I'm in London to do I was here to do a lecture and to have IRC meetings, to do your podcast, needless to say, a very attractive reason to come to London. But Ed Balls, my former colleague in the House of Commons, it's the 50th anniversary of the first match between the Parliament, between MPs and the lobby, the media. And he said, "Are you by any chance in London on the 10th of May?" And I said, "Well, as it happens, I am." He said, "Well, can you come to Loftus Road to play centre back?" I haven't played football for 26 years, so this is going to be a test. But he said there will be photographers. I said, let's hope for the best.
Please be careful.
Yes, exactly. I don't want a dislocated knee.
You get a lot of information from the front line, and I guess you get protected against it to a certain extent. Are there ever times when it feels like too much?
Yeah, but you've just got to remember it's much tougher for people who are not protected.
What advice would you give to young David?
I should have had a much longer time at MIT as a graduate student. I stupidly did my master's in 1 year. I should have spent longer doing that. I thought British politics couldn't do without me for another year, so I was wrong about that. I think see the world. I didn't. In a way, I wish I'd gone to Tsinghua University in Beijing in 1989. Get a broader perspective, a broader lens on things. Meet my wife earlier. That would have been great.
In preparing for the conversation today, we spoke to a number of people.
Oh God, that's worrying.
No, but in soft and hard power, and the overwhelming response from everyone was on your intelligence and your integrity. So I know you're doing a huge job at the moment, and you've got your commitments to your family, but I do hope we see you back in UK politics.
Well, that's very
soon.
nice of you to say that, so I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for the time. All content of High Net Purpose is provided as general information only. It does not constitute any advice, recommendation, or representations, and is not intended to influence listeners or users into making any specific investments or any other decisions. Please be aware that guests and presenters on High Net Purpose may have investments in any of the topics or products being discussed. Their reviews and opinions are their own and should not be taken as endorsements or financial advice. Before making financial decisions, we strongly recommend seeking advice from a qualified financial professional. This podcast may not be copied, reproduced, further distributed, or published in whole or part.